Hello and welcome to the Freaky Sideshow YouTube channel. Today we're going to be talking about near-death experiences, which I have personal experience with, ghosts and UFOs. I'm going to get right into the share screen. Okay, just to give you a little background on myself, I grew up in Titusville, Florida. I was fortunate enough as a teenager to watch all the Apollo moon rockets go off. I collected 1962 Mars Attacks cards. I'm 67 and I still collect them. I was a big fan of the Jetsons and everything that had to do with futurism. In 1966, my father and I looked forward to the first episode of Star Trek, and I became a Trekkie. And then Big Daddy Ed Roth and all of his futuristic creations, VW Trikes, and this is the Mysterion. Big Outer Limits fan. One Step Beyond. I was a big fan of all the paranormal shows. Now, as an adult, I looked into this and found out that a lot of these episodes are based on true stories. If you look into the true stories, they're pretty interesting. This is me at 17. I was a big fan of the 1951 movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still. And I especially had a connection with Klaatu's ending speech, where he warned against the elimination of nuclear weapons, or else the Earth would be dealt with pretty harshly. Joined the Army, 101st Airborne in 1973. And when I got out of the Army, I hitchhiked for about 3 years and ran into the Rainbow People. This was a group of people who lived on the road all year round and would meet at a national forest every year. And I really enjoyed those gatherings. Swami Prabhupada brought his Krishna movement over here, and in the 70s, that was going really strong. But eventually hitchhiked back to Indiana and went to Indiana University for a while as a theater student. But unfortunately, I fell into selling used cars because I felt like I needed money, and went through a 6 year marriage and a divorce. Wound up going back to Florida, living on the beach for a while, and eventually hooked up with the Grateful Dead. I was following the Dead from 1985 to 1988. And that was actually a fun time. I sold crystal jewelry in the parking lot. Half the time I didn't know what town I was in. So it was good therapy for a recently divorced guy. At the age of 37, I wound up back in Indiana University and I pursued a 4 year degree in occupational therapy. Now, occupational therapy doesn't have anything to do with getting people jobs. It's a where you restore function on people that have lost it. I did a lot of seating and positioning in wheelchairs and ADLs, activities of daily living, trying to get the patients who had had some sort of sickness or accident back on their feet and back home. But on August the 18th of 2009, I went home to mow the grass and suffered a massive heart attack and had a near death experience, which I will elaborate in another video. But to make a long story short, I suddenly found myself in the presence of several ethereal beings, and one of them was a transcended version of myself. And the only way I can describe these beings is intelligent lightning. I learned that as I live this physical life, I also have a different version of myself. People call it a higher self, or author Anthony Peake calls it the daemon. I read his book about that. So we are currently in quantum superposition, just like an electron has a measured value in three-dimensional reality, as well as being connected to a probability cloud in a condition known as superposition, which means two situations at once. Um, that's the way we are. All biological life, the entire physical universe is in superposition with a higher realm. I decided to drive myself to the hospital, and on the way, I had several insights. Insight number one is that consciousness survives death. Insight number two, we live in a multi-dimensional universe. Insight number three, dying is simply a transition of consciousness from this current physical reality to a coexistent non-physical reality where you reunite with your higher self and other beings of similar resonance. I was given a choice between going farther in this life or actually crossing over. They made it clear to me that they'd be there for me, but I decided to live on to fix a few things in my life. Anytime I had caused hurt or pain in another person here in this life, that's what was on my mind as I was passing away. Insight number 4: as I approached the veil to transition from this physical world to a non physical reality, relationships with others that were hurtful here on earth weighed heavily on my soul. I drove myself to the hospital here in Henry County, and they weren't really set up to deal with my condition. So they put me on an ambulance and set me up about an hour away to Muncie, Indiana. And there I was met with a team of doctors that were ready to give me a quadruple bypass operation. And I didn't want to go that route. So I asked them if there's any options. And they said they could try a couple of stents, but they couldn't guarantee its success. And that was almost 14 years ago. So I did have the 2 stents placed on the back of my heart, and it fixed me up pretty good. I began reading, never really was much of an avid pleasure reader. Got straight A's through college. I could read if I had to, but this became a passion of mine. And I read Dr. Eben Alexander's book, Proof of Heaven, about how he had a fantastic phenomenological experience while he was essentially brain dead. And a lot of bodies of information that I ordinarily wouldn't be attracted to, I found myself suddenly attracted to. One of them was the Seth material from Jane Roberts from 1971. And in particular, there was different phrases that would pop out that resonated with my near-death experience. One was where Seth said, your physical life is just a fleshy extension of your dreaming life, because when you pass away, that's exactly how it feels. It feels like you're waking up to a great remembrance, another layer of reality that you're familiar with, and this physical life just becomes like a dream. Another body of material that I found useful was the raw material. This is a series of books channeled by Carla Ruckert in 1981. And in particular, here's a few things that I felt useful. This is from the Raw Material Book 2, page 64. The higher self operates from the future as we understand things. This has a strange coincidence with Dr. Nick Bostrom's simulation hypothesis, where he projects that we're a civilization in the distant future who are creating ancestor replications or simulations. The higher self is aware of the lessons learned through sixth density and is attempting to enter the seventh density, the portal to the cosmic supermind. Um, Years later, I ran into Dr. Bernardo Kastrup's information that consciousness itself is the underlying nature of reality. The fourth density is the last density of positive negative dualism. Here, souls begin to form oversoul groups. And then the fifth and sixth density, both positive and negative, are completely polarized and no longer involved in the conflict of dualism, unless by proximity. Sixth density beings no longer need a craft, as they are able to perceive the universe as a cohesive whole, a living entity, and have access to all points in time and space. So there's a lot of things in this body of channel material that I felt coordinated with my own phenomenological experience in 2009. Another channeled material, this is a 2001 page tome that was published first in 1955. There was a Dr. Sadler, I believe in the 30s, that transcribed the husband of a patient of his that would be in a trance state and would dictate to Dr. Sadler. And then he eventually had it printed. Rudolf Steiner's work was pretty interesting. The Dead Are With Us, where you can communicate with the dead through dreams. Then there's other material like UFO abduction experiencer Whitley Strieber, who was really frightened of his experience at first, and then his brand new book, New World, he postulates that the beings that represented his visitors were attempting a symbiotic relationship. That's pretty much where I'm at, is a symbiosis between humans and the other. So my first step was to get involved with ghosts. I researched the etheric revenants, which they feed on human negative energies such as fear and anxiety. Strange correlation with in ufology, you have the reptilians that feed on loose negative energy from humans. They might be some sort of etheric revenant. Crowd demons. Now, these are just names that humans assign to various phenomena, but crowd demons are attracted to crowds of humans that appear on film as darkened, distorted humanoid figures. Animal ghosts, like phantom birds or vanishing dogs, present with sounds or smells. You have your vortexes. They appear indoors with a sudden drop in temperature. If you remember on the movie The Exorcist, there's a sudden drop in temperature. And other entities may piggyback on them, sometimes confused with orbs. Inanimate ghosts like the Flying Dutchman, doppelgangers, appear as doubles of someone. Persons can be incarnate or discarnate, known to project in two locations or bilocations simultaneously. Kobolds can appear as a talking animal or talking fire. Lemurs, which are an angry wandering ghost, and poltergeist. Now, the interesting thing about the noisy ghost or psychokinetic activity is, as author John Keel pointed out, whenever there's a UFO wave, the adults are reporting UFO sightings while the teenagers are reporting psychokinetic poltergeist activity. And it makes you wonder if some of these objects, wherever they come from, leave a wake of paranormal activity behind them. I had the opportunity in 2012 to spend the night in a real ghost house. This is the Rhodes Hotel in Atlanta, Indiana. And people showed up trying to attempt to communicate with the other side using various types of EVP equipment. Some had the little ghost radar on their phone. I was really skeptical that entities from the other side could communicate through human electronics, but my mind was opened somewhat by the work of Dr. Dean Radin. He's the professor of noetic sciences in California, who did experiments with random word generators and found out that human thought statistically significantly affects random word generators. Then Lynn McTaggart wrote The Field, The Quest for the Secret Force of the Universe. There's something I ran into in the literature called the Pekindarian experience, where a person has a physical interaction and or actual conversation with another person, and then later they discover that this person had been deceased for a period of time before their encounter. So, insight number 5, discarnate human and non-human entities can appear to incarnate humans as apparitions in dreamscape or even as physical beings. Landed into the Omega Project. This is my first connection between ghosts and near-death experiences and the UFO encounters and mind at large. So I read how the Oz factor that comes into play, where your whole reality is like shifting in high strangeness, terms like that. But he got me interested into the UFO field, so I fell down that rabbit hole. Started out, I read everything that Dr. Jacques Vallée read: Anatomy of a Phenomena, Dimensions, Messengers of Deception, Timothy Good's material, Above Top Secret, Leslie Kean's book, UFOs. And at some point, you just reach, like Ted Bundy, this moment where you realize that the UFO phenomenon is real. And that is a major shift in reality perception. Then you get into the Jungian explanations, and all the explanations. You accept that the UFO phenomenon is real, but then it becomes, what are their nature? Who or what are they, and where they come from? And Dr. Young was actually obsessed with flying saucers, more so than he let on publicly, and wrote a pretty good book about flying saucers, where whatever intelligence is behind them is connected to the collective human unconscious. And the way our cognitive apparatus works, we're actually collapsing probability waves into our 5 senses. So an advanced intelligence could send a probability wave to a human brain and make them see just about anything they want to. And we noticed that from the 50s to the 2000s, the UFO presentations are morphing and changing quite a bit. Started out as the clunky tin cans of the 40s, 50s, looked like somebody threw a hubcap into the air. And now people are seeing fantastic light ships and shape shifting objects that are much more sophisticated than the original UFO sightings turned out. Same with crop circles, they're increasing with complexity. Dr. Mead Lane back in the 40s, who was in charge of Borderline Science Group, his little book, The Coming of the Guardians, an interpretation of the flying saucers as given from the other side of life. So there's this connection with the UFO phenomenon and the other side of life. This really leads into what I call crypto reality. It's a reality that's all around you all the time, but it's hidden. It's hidden from your awareness. It's hidden from your consciousness. You just file these things in your brain somehow. But I began remembering things that happened at a very early age. In 1961, when I was 6 years old, I'm 67 now, I had an encounter with two, what I know today as a shadow being. This is a very benign encounter. Now, these two beings were so black that they wouldn't even let light out of them. They're like a black hole. Light couldn't even escape. And my understanding now is they were just an aspect of myself or somebody that I know that was just checking up on me. They walked over to me, they bent over, they seemed to be attending to me, and then they stood back up, looked at each other face to face, and vanished from my room. A few years later, in 1966, I was 11 years old, and I was wandering down the driveway one day in Titusville, Florida. It was a nice sunny day, and I looked up and I saw five or six bronze and pewter colored saucers that were so stationary it looked like somebody just painted them into the landscape. But my reaction as an 11-year-old was to just fall on my knees and cry because I was afraid they were going to leave me without taking me home. This is what I was thinking when I was 11 years old. So this is a memory that was filed in some part of my brain. I don't really know what the nature of this experience was. As it turns out, in the literature, you'll find out that 1966 there was a global UFO wave. So that was an interesting data point to connect with this childhood experience that I had. In 1978, I had about an entire year of what they call sleep paralysis. I'd wake up and I was awake, but I couldn't move. Once or twice a week, this happened for about an entire year. And this was followed in 1979 with a following in my car of a luminous orb with about 4 hours of missing time. I was driving from Indianapolis to Bloomington. I had a female friend with me, and I vaguely remember her saying to put the pedal to the metal, that we're being chased. And later on, I reconnected with her about 33 years later, and she told me her version of it. She had tried to get in touch with Bud Hopkins, who's an alien abduction researcher, but he was having health issues at the time and wanted her to find me. And at the time, she couldn't. But I've decided not to undergo the hypnotic regression because I'm thinking there was probably a reason why those 4 hours were blocked out. I should have been home by 1 or 2 in the morning, but I was there at dawn. So there's about 4 hours of missing time. Insight number 6, I may have had several interactions with extraterrestrials or interdimensionals myself from early childhood. And the memories are either filed away or ignored or blocked completely from my conscious memory until my near death experience in 2009. Read all of Dr. Michael Newton's material. His book, Journey of Souls, was particularly useful. And what he found, he hypnotized people in between lifetimes and found out that cross culturally, people pretty much had the same report of the afterlife, the life review, and whatnot. Now, at the University of Virginia, they're actually coming up with a formal theory of reincarnation based on about 2,500 cases of small children who report details to their parents of past lives, and then the parents check it out and find out that it's all accurate. Insight number 7, in the discarnate world, humans, extraterrestrials, and interdimensionals associate with one another. Remembering the early contactee in the 50s, George Van Tassel, one of his abduction experiences as he was sleeping out in the open under the starry sky was that he reported extraterrestrials along with discarnate humans on board. Now, Ray Hernandez, who founded the Free organization with Dr. Edgar Mitchell before he passed away, they've got several volumes now of consciously reported experiences with non-human intelligence. That's pretty interesting. And for the most part, they found out that these experiences are positive in nature. There's another abduction researcher, Dr. David Jacobs, who kind of has a foreboding view, but All of his information is gleaned through hypnotic trance. So we've got a couple of data points to connect. David Jacobs, reports from hypnotic trance state, and then the free organization's consciously remembered experiences to compare to. Insight number 8, near-death experiences, alien abductions, and other types of encounters with NHI, non-human intelligence, are all connected to one another within mind at large. Insight number 9, contact between humans and non-human intelligence is the norm, not the exception. Contact with non-human intelligence is happening to multitudes of humans on Earth each and every day, and has been for a very long time now. In Edgar Cayce's material, there was a mention of a device called a Firestone. It was a crystalline device that would allow humans in 3 dimensions to connect with beings on the other side. And there are people who are working on this. This is Guglielmo Marconi and Nikola Tesla. Both these guys were the fathers of modern electricity, and they both considered themselves in touch with non-human intelligence, giving them instructions on what to build. Nikola Tesla was working on something called a Tesla Spirit Radio. Now, I actually have one of these with the schematics that you can find online. I just haven't put it together and played with it yet. But there's somebody who is probably one of the smartest people on Earth that thinks he can talk to the other side through a technological means. Now, Dr. Bernardo Kastrup is talking about metaphysical idealism. He's instrumental in converting the scientific world from their current Newtonian paradigm of physicalism, where consciousness is an epiphenomenon or a byproduct of inanimate objects, subatomic particles, arranging themselves somehow into a complex enough system that consciousness arises as a byproduct. Now, Dr. Bernardo Kastrup comes along and flips that and says that the physical universe is actually the extrinsic appearance of a cosmic mind, and that consciousness itself is fundamental, what they call the ontological primitive. Another player in this conversation is cognitive scientist Donald Hoffman. He wrote The Case Against Reality, and there's an interesting podcast by Michael Shermer, who's the editor of Skeptic Magazine, with Donald Hoffman. And it's fun to watch Michael Shermer squirm a little bit when Dr. Donald Hoffman tells him that objective reality and space-time as we know it is doomed, that all of our senses are just looking at desktop icons that hide a tremendous amount of underlying information, just like the desktop icons on our computer hide all kinds of circuitry and different gates and so forth. Dr. Robert Lanza has 3 books out on biocentrism, basically the same thing, an idealist perspective where consciousness is fundamental. So insight number 10, physicalism, the scientific paradigm in which inanimate matter or subatomic particles arrange themselves into enough complexity that mind and consciousness automatically arise, is stuck with the hard problem of consciousness, because no matter how you rearrange inanimate objects, the end product's going to be inanimate. And in the case of a television receiver, you can mess with the circuitry. There are correlations between the brain and phenomenological experience, but that doesn't mean that that phenomenological experience exists within the brain, just like the picture is not actually inside the television tube. It's being received by the circuitry inside. And Tesla believed that our brains were a receiver instead of anything that produces original thought. Whereas idealism, a new scientific paradigm in which consciousness itself is the irreducible ontological primitive, or the underlying nature of reality, and matter arises from consciousness. Matter is actually an epiphenomenon of consciousness instead of vice versa. And this is the key to understanding UFOs and the paranormal, in my opinion. And I'll leave you with a final thought by controversial guru Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh. He's the subject of the Netflix documentary Wild Wild Country. He started a commune here in the United States called Rajneesh Puram. But I've got 50 hours of Osho, is the name he actually goes by, But in those 50 hours, everything he said, I couldn't really find anywhere where I disagreed with him. So even though he might have been a little controversial regarding sexual activity and material possessions, when asked one time, is there life after death? He famously replied, this is life after death. Where do you think you were before you got here? And with that, I'll end this particular presentation. And I appreciate you tuning in to Freaky Sideshow YouTube channel. I took a big break for several years and continued reading and studying. So I think I'm ready to present some new presentations. So see you next time.